how to make creative. It reminds us of the old chestnut form content identity. For that, however, let's bring out the contrast between A.C. Bradley's poetry for poetry sex and Peter Kevy's Hiroshi's essay in differences. This follows a native speaker.
Claim that form and content are identical across the arts, but especially in poetry. That is the view he attributes to Bradley, and he calls it the no-paraphrase claim. The no-paraphrase claim, with regard to poetry, is that any attempt to state the content of a poem in any words other than those of the poem itself will not accurately paraphrase its content. So if we think of the words of the poem as its form, and what the poem says as its content, it turns out that they cannot be prized apart. If the words, the form, were one thing and what the words said another, then, according to Bradley and his followers, what the poem says could be said in other words, its content could be put in another form. However, such is not the case. The poem cannot be paraphrased. Therefore, its content and form, what it says and how it says it, are one and inseparable. Point 4. 4. Kivy thinks this is pretty implausible and immediately cites a potential counterexample, namely Lucretius de Rerum Natura, which, although in poetic form, is essentially a treatise on Epicurean natural philosophy. Kivy is certain that Lucretius recognized a difference between form and content. He cites a passage where Lucretius states that the verse form is just a way of making the doctrines a bit more palatable, implying that the content could easily have been expressed in prose, i.e. in a different form. This in turn raises the question whether Bradley is using form-content identity as a mark of poetry in general, or only as a mark of good poetry. This only as a mark of good poetry. This, for Kivy, is further evidence of how confused Bradley is. Kivy sometimes calls the no-paraphrase claim 5 the ineffability thesis, the view that the content of a poem is ineffable, i.e. For Kivy, on the Unity, pp. 86-7. 5. It is perhaps significant that Bradley only uses the term paraphrase once in his lecture, p. 20, and that only incidentally. It was Clent Brooks who highlighted that term in his essay, The Heresy of Paraphrase, 1947, in the well-wrought urn, Studies in the Structure of Poetry, London, Methuen, 1968. Bradley speaks frequently of a heresy, but not explicitly of a heresy of paraphrase. Kivy makes no mention of Brooks, yet in this regard runs Bradley and Brooks together. Inexpressible in any other vehicle, but the poem itself. Point 6. He thinks the ineffability thesis is motivated by an aspiration of poets to have a special access to knowledge, or access to a special kind of knowledge. What makes the thesis of form-content identity attractive is its seeming power to regain for poetry its ancient epistemic status, lost in the wake of the scientific revolution, and the specialization of the knowing game. If the content of the poem could be paraphrased, then that paraphrase would inevitably fall into one of the categories of human knowledge populated by resident authorities, who perforce would outrank the poet in expertise. The ineffability thesis assures the poet his expertise, making him sovereign over a special, unpoachable knowledge reserved. Expertise, making him sovereign over a special, unpoachable knowledge reserve. Point 7. I mention this claim because it plays quite a central role in Kivy's argument. It gives us a further reason, he thinks, for rejecting form-content identity, but I am going to set it aside partly because it has no place in my own defense of the unity of form and content, partly because, as I see it, it has no place in Bradley's either. Kivy asks, how plausible is the thesis that we cannot successfully say in words other than those of the poem what the poem is expressing? 80 quite rightly insists that we cannot answer that until we have a criterion of success. His worry is that the standard of success will either be set so high that it couldn't reasonably be attained or, worse, that successful paraphrase is made impossible in effect by stipulation. He calls the latter conventional as sulk. 9. One way he thinks the bar is set unreasonably high, or perhaps is the wrong kind of bar altogether, is an appeal to the experience of the poem. If the criterion for successful paraphrase is the reproduction of the poem's total effect on the reader, then of course, he agrees, paraphrase will not be possible. This criterion of success, reproduction of the poem's total effect on the reader, is in fact nonsensical, because it demands of paraphrase something that never was the object of the exercise in the first place. No one who sets out to say in prose the content of what a poem says in poetic form intends, as the goal of the task, to provide an alternative way of experiencing the poem. And to fault the interpreter for failing to do what is not the point of interpretation in the first place is plain nonsense. 10. Nonsense. 10. We will need to return to the issue of experience. But meanwhile, following the dialectic of the argument, Kivi's strategy is this: finding no reasonable criterion for success in Bradley, he proposes one himself. Forget about complete or perfect paraphrase and settle for the modest claim that we can say in plain words more or less what the content of a poem is. 11. Capturing a poem's content more or less in a paraphrase is, for Kivi, enough to scotch the strong form content identity thesis. On the matter of how we experience a poem, he also proposes a moderate view, namely that sometimes the form and content of a poem are experienced as indissolubly fused, sometimes, quite properly, not. A view he takes to be harmlessly true. 12. Interestingly, he doesn't say what it is to experience form and content as indissolubly fused, and even that possibility might seem a surprising concession to the Bradleyans. He thinks, though, that Bradley's likely response is to insist that when we experience a poem properly we fuse form and content. But here Kivi smells a rat. What's the test for a proper experience? Well, fusing form and content. And that, of course, Kivi quite rightly notes, is hopelessly circular. It is always hard to argue against moderate or modest poetians, and Kivi's reassuring common sense is, as ever, very seductive. Drop the identity of form and content, he tells us, replace it with special intimacy. Drop the thought that form and content are always intimate, replace with sometimes. Drop even the thought that this is a peculiarity of poetic meaning, acknowledge, innocuously, that we can find it all over the place. The strict form-content identity theorist is left seeming unreasonably extreme, flying in the face of obvious facts. It does indeed seem obvious that in the vast majority of cases a careful paraphrase can capture more or less a poem's content. The trouble is, it seems so obvious that it is hard to believe that its denial is at the heart of the form-content identity thesis. In defending Bradley, I shall not seek to deny Kivi's moderate pro-paraphrase claims. Instead, I want to shift the whole focus of the discussion. As I see it, Bradley's central concerns are less about paraphrase, more about value, less about what poems mean, more about how to read poetry. To anticipate, I don't think that the unity of form and content is something we discover in poetry, but something that we demand of it. I don't think it is a contingent fact that in some poems form and content fuse, while in others they don't. I don't think it is a matter of degree whether form and content coincide, that it happens more in some cases than others. I don't even think that content is best explained in terms of meaning. Indeed, I think it is misleading to say that poems as such, as opposed to parts of poems, have meaning at all. The expression, the meaning of the poem, taken literally, never picks out something. So if paraphrase means give the same meaning as, then it is not a contingent, but a logical truth that poems are unparaphrasable. I don't think that interpretation of poetry aims primarily at paraphrase. Nor do I think that interpretation is only marginally or contingently connected to experience. It is essentially so. Finally, I don't think the Lucretius case is a counterexample to form-content unity.